in 1966, as early as 1966, there is nothing in America resembling an organized emergency medical service. So in most municipalities, you are probably going to get the police, who might show up with some old hand-carried stretcher and a couple empty oxygen tanks, or you might have the funeral home. Somehow it has seemed to escape everybody's attention that you could make more money through a funeral than you could by saving somebody's life. So funeral homes probably had the most, the ultimate conflict of interest in this, but yet in most cities, they were the only ones capable of transporting a human body around town. And so you'd have undertakers embalming bodies one night, transporting the next. Calls would come out. They would quickly sweep the flower petals out of the back of the hearse and race off to respond to an emergency call. And generally what they had was a stretcher, maybe some towels, and about 6 hours of first aid training. And that was about it. That was the person who was going to show up in your moment of greatest need. So in 1966, this paper gets published, and it's been referred to ever since as the White Paper. And basically what it said was that it pointed out the fact that in 1965, more Americans died on US highways than had died in the entirety of the Korean War. And it said also that you are more likely to survive if you were shot in Vietnam than if you were shot back home in the US. And the reason for that, of course, was the fact that the guy, crouching in some Southeast Asian rice paddy has a corpsman sitting next to him. The person who is, sitting at home in Columbia, South Carolina, has his friend and a car, and that's it. And so the person back in Columbia is going to die, whereas the guy, in a jungle on the other side of the world is going to live. So the corpsman was this, critical piece of medicine that was missing in the US. And so when this paper comes out, they establish this fact that, hey, there's a huge hole in emergency medicine. Thousands upon tens of thousands of Americans are dying from it. We need to get something done about it. And so they the Department of Transportation of all people says, okay, you can now have this thing called a paramedic, and how you train them and equip them and who does it and how you're going to pay for it, that's all up to you. We aren't going to mandate any of that, nor are we going to help you in any way. However, you can go ahead and do it. And that was it. So they acknowledged this huge problem, but they took 0 steps to actually help anyone get it done. So clearly, if anything was going to happen, it was going to take some sort of stroke of luck and genius, this perfect confluence of events. And there's Mr. Moon down there at the bottom. And as luck would have it, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at the time that this white paper has come out, there happened to be 2 men who were sort of perfect for the moment. One was by the name of Peter Safar, who was this sort of genius physician who was known as the father of CPR for having invented that process back in the 1950s. And you had another guy by the name of Phil Hallen, who recognized this huge hole that existed in Pittsburgh medicine and wanted to fix it. But he didn't want to fix it any old way. Phil Hallen is a very special and unique individual. And for him, fixing the medical problem was only part of it. The other part of it was that, in his perspective, the city of Pittsburgh was among the most segregated cities in America. And he looked at people that were living in a couple different neighborhoods, specifically one called the Hill District. And he said, if we could find a way to present the people who live in this neighborhood with something of their own, I'm convinced that they could take with it and make of it exactly all the things that people are doubting that they could. And so he not only wanted to create a medical system, but he wanted to provide the opportunity for the people most in need of that medical system to provide that service to themselves. And so these 2 guys, Peter Safar and Phil Hallen, set out to recruit, train, and deploy the world's first fully trained paramedic corps. And as they are going through that process, there happens to be a angry, somewhat precocious, but remarkably well-dressed young man named John Moon, who is making his way through the 1960s. And he's got a budding afro, and he's got a dashiki on, and he has been reared on the civil rights movement, and he has watched sit-ins and marches fire hoses, police dogs, has seen the whole thing. And he's a very motivated young man who's come to believe that his generation is here to change the world. After graduating from high school, he goes into the steel mill. He works for time as an orderly, and he's trying to find a way to do the things that he's convinced that he can do, that the last decade of his life has told him for the first time in American history is available to you. And one night, while he is working as an orderly, which, if you don't know, is the bottom rung of the medical world, medical ladder, into the room that he's in walk two African-American men in white jackets with a radio and confidence and a level of competency that he had never seen before. He's instantly smitten. And he turns sort of to himself and he says, I'm going to find a way to do that. And so, with no further ado, here's John Moon. And John, tell us, those guys walk into your room. How does that change your life?
Well, it was a unique opportunity that I didn't see coming at all, believe it or not. They impressed upon me a lot of different things. And one was their confidence in doing what they were doing. And I have to agree with Kevin, being an orderly at a hospital was at the bottom rung. You primarily didn't do anything regarding the patient unless you were directed to do it either by the nurse or by the doctors themselves. So you were more or less like the go-to person. You did the lifting, you did the bed making and the bedpan emptying and things of that nature. So to me, I wasn't pleased with just doing that. The inner part of me just said there's something more that you could be doing for people than what you were doing. And once these two gentlemen came in, I actually never said anything to them, believe it or not. I just watched them go about their business, and they took the patient and they left. Shortly after that, I made up my mind to say, that's what I need to be doing. And I thought that I was an orderly. I had an orderly class. So I went to Freedom House's offices, which were located in Presbyterian Hospital at the time, to apply for a job there. And the gentleman that interviewed me showed me a couple of slides and tests and things that I had absolutely no idea what they were. And he told me I wasn't qualified to work there. So needless to say, hurt and dejected, I left. And that inner part of me that kept talking, that kept saying, well, there has to be a way for you to get training to do the things that he showed you to do. So in the meantime, I did some research and found out that they were holding a emergency medical technician class at one of the fire academies right in the city. And I fortunately signed up for it. And for 3 days a week, 4 hours a day, 13 weeks, I attended this class. And once I passed the course, which was a written and a practical exam, I went back to Freedom House and showed them my certificate and was hired on the spot. And as that saying goes, the rest, fortunately, is history. So a little bit about myself. Prior to all of that, I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. And that was back in the 60s when I was there. So unfortunately, the state itself was completely segregated. And as fate would have it, I was adopted by a family here in Pennsylvania that I had no idea existed. And I came here to Pittsburgh and continued to go to high school. And during my last year of high school, 1967, the riots broke out as a result of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And I lived through that. And secretly telling you all, I was actually a part of it, part of the destruction and part of the looting and polluting and things of that nature.
Statute of limitations, John. You are free and clear, my friend.
Yes. That's the statute of limitations has ran out, so I'm good. So I was all a part of that. And my generation at that time in the 60s, we were the generation that had decided we were going to change the outlook of history. We were going to make ourselves more voiceful and protest more to let society know that we were not satisfied with the way Blacks were being treated, both in educational, in housing, in jobs. So we took on that challenge, which led me to become relatively a militant. So I had the afro and the dashiki and the beads around my neck and was flashing a Black Power sign at every time you spoke to somebody and things. So I went through all of that. And that lasted roughly about 3 or 4 years until I started working for Freedom House. And that sent me on an entirely different path to allow me to be more of a positive influence, not only in the community, but to the patients I served also. And that itself increased the pride I had, the confidence I had. And I'm truly blessed to have been a part of Freedom House. And I think it's a debt that I would never be able to repay, primarily because it was the foundation, not only of EMS as we see it today, but it was the foundation that propelled me into an EMS career with the city of Pittsburgh. So I worked there for about 34 years. And everything I learned at Freedom House played a very, very instrumental role in my employment there with the city of Pittsburgh.
It might be worth noting here, John, that at the time that you do this, and you missed some of it, I did sort of a quick rundown of kind of what got us to the white paper in '66. But it's worth noting that, you know, when you started this thing right around 1970, when you get hired, the world at large does not really know what a paramedic is. Nobody's really heard the term. It essentially does not exist. There are a couple of cities who have caught wind of what's happening in Pittsburgh and are trying to do something similar, but nobody really knows. And so you guys are forging this brand new thing. So as this young guy who has no particular experience, you show up, you know, you've got this jacket and you have your training, but you don't really know what's going on. Can you tell us about, you know, the first time that you're on an ambulance and you are sent to an emergency call? I know that feeling intimately. It's horrifying. Yours is particularly embarrassing, and I like to bring it up all the time. So can you tell us about it?
Yeah, it was a very eye-opening experience. My very first call with Freedom House was a gentleman that had collapsed in the business district of downtown Pittsburgh, and he was unconscious. To me, that propelled me into preparing for what I was going to do on this call. So we jump in the back of the ambulance, and my partner, who was driving at the time, proceeded to place the lights and siren on, and we flew in the middle of traffic around rush hour to downtown Pittsburgh. In the meantime, in my ride down there, everything on Freedom House's ambulances were sterilized. The bag valve mask, the drug kit and everything. So en route to this call, I opened all this stuff up, preparing to have a cardiac arrest. Unbeknownst to me, we arrive on the scene and there's a group of people standing around this guy, and he was standing up talking to him. Needless to say, I had torn open all the sterilized equipment, and I was very embarrassed at that time. So my partner looked at me and said, you know, you might want to kind of relax and calm down until you get to the scene of a call, and then map out your game plan prior to getting there. So I had contaminated a lot of the equipment in the back of the ambulance before I got to a call, and didn't need it. So I had to retreat and go back to Presbyterian Hospital and turn all of this unused, contaminated equipment back to them. They weren't very happy with it at all. But I'll never forget that call because it was my very first one, and it was the most embarrassing call that I'd ever gone on. Everything else from that point on was come on with it, bring it.
Yeah.
So, but it was an eye-opening experience for me. But I got to the point where I kind of mistook the experience that I had and didn't take it into consideration. And I had to relive that moment over and over again. And I learned from it. I learned that no matter what the circumstances was, based on the training that you had, that wasn't a situation that you wouldn't be able to handle, none whatsoever. And I took that same mindset with me when we went to the city of Pittsburgh.
So this around 71, this is kind of where we are in the timeline. The interesting thing here is that the Freedom House paramedics have gone through about 300 hours of training. And that includes time, that not just classroom time, but also time in the ER, time in the OR, time in the morgue, time in the OB, everywhere you can imagine. And the next closest paramedic group has about 180 hours of training. So these guys are hands down better trained at this point in the early 70s than any unit coming in, including Los Angeles, which becomes very famous because of the TV show Emergency. And yet, while that's happening, there is both skepticism about the effectiveness of EMS, but more particularly a resistance from the city of Pittsburgh to field this particular group of paramedics. And remember, as I said before, the original idea was not only to create this groundbreaking medical corps, but also for it to be very specifically a vehicle for African-American advancement. And there was a mayor in the city who took exception to that. So John, can you talk to us a bit about being an organization that, Hollywood is sending its producers to follow, that cities around the country are trying to mimic, that everybody has been left in the dust by, but yet getting banged up at home by your own politicians?
And that was a very unique experience. It was kind of sad in a sense, primarily because Freedom House itself primarily served an underserved, as we call it today, predominantly Black community. And they had state-of-the-art pre-hospital care. Some of your affluent communities in other parts of town did not have that type of care. They had to resort to using the police for transport to the hospital. So you had Freedom House with the state-of-the-art vehicle, equipment, training, and all African-American organization. And we're competing in a political environment. And that political environment, along with racism, reared its ugly head at the latter parts of Freedom House. So you have a mayor who had to adhere to the wishes of their constituents, saying, how dare you have this underserved ghetto type community getting better pre-hospital care than we get. We're the ones that place you in the office, we pay your taxes, and we don't have that type of stuff. So the mayor was kind of put on notice that you have to do something. So during that time frame, Freedom House was still operating day in and day out. So in order to discourage Freedom House, the mayor sent out a memorandum to us that stated that we could not use our sirens to go on medical calls, which unfortunately impacted your response times. In addition to that, basically, you had to deal with the police, who oftentimes would be on your calls and would not allow you to touch the patients. In addition to that, we found ourselves being left out on a lot of life-threatening calls. And as a result, we had to monitor the police radios. So we purchased a scanner and we monitored police radios. And whenever they received a call, which was of a life-threatening nature, we would beat the police to the scene of that call. And oftentimes we would beat them there, take the patient and be en route to the hospital while they were on. Unfortunately, there were some calls where we arrived there simultaneously, and that created a uncomfortable position. One call in particular that stands out to me was an automobile accident where the police were there on the scene. Freedom House arrives, and they're literally pulling this patient out of a wrecked vehicle. So we get out and we, in a demanding way, that's how we were, tell the police officers, no, 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 you can't do that. Leave the patient alone. The guy looked around at us and used a few choice words, both that are not in the Bible, and both are very racial sensitive, to tell us with the threat of arrest to leave the patient alone. Subsequently, we had to abide by this guy who was a white male carrying a gun, not to mention they had long nightsticks back then. So we had to relinquish that. But we learned from that to the point where we had to spend more of our time beating the police to these calls, and not only getting there before them, leaving the scene before they got there, because we became a threat to the police. And they didn't hesitate to use their legal authority at that particular time. There was no what you would call accountability for police actions during the late 60s, early 70s. So it was a free-for-all. And those were just a few of the different trials or barriers that we had to overcome. Not to mention there were times where we would encounter white patients that wouldn't want us to touch them, particularly during the physical exam. So we had to kind of endure that component that was built into the system itself, but it didn't despair or discourage any of us from doing our job. We knew what we had to offer, and we continued to do it for as long as we were allowed to do it. And once the political winds started shifting, we couldn't compete in that political environment. So the city of Pittsburgh decided to start their own EMS system. Unfortunately, there was no room in this new system for Freedom House. And subsequently, the city of Pittsburgh stopped their funding through Freedom House, and subsequently hired their own personnel in addition to brand new, they called them super ambulances at that particular time. And they brought in a all-white workforce, and subsequently phased out Freedom House Ambulance Service and offered positions to the 30 or so employees that were working there. That in itself was a shocking type of situation, both for me and some of my colleagues to enter into, because we knew we weren't wanted there. There were times when we would go on calls and the patient would ask, who is that person you have with them? And we carried the label not as my coworker or my partner or whatever, oh, that's the person from Freedom House. And we carried that label for easily the first year that we were there. Unfortunately, the city instituted different ways to get rid of as many of Freedom House's employees as they possibly could. And they did this by refusing to allow or to accept any of the training that we had gone through. You have to remember that we were trained by one of the best, Dr. Nancy Caroline. We had set the standards for ambulance design and equipment. We had been licensed by the Department of Transportation, which is an arm of the federal government. But going into a municipal system, none of that training was accepted. And it was a way to root out as many of Freedom House's employees as they possibly could. And unfortunately, it was very, very successful. The ones that remained were scattered throughout other city departments. One in particular comes to mind. One lady was, who was a paramedic, was assigned to frisk female prisoners at the city jail. Another gentleman was assigned to work at the city's municipal garage, pumping gas for city vehicles. And the rest of the individuals were scattered throughout the city at various EMS units. Myself was relegated to the role of a third person. I couldn't examine the patient. I couldn't make decisions on patient care. I was just there to observe. The beauty of that was that karma came about to the point where the crews I was working with were dispatched to a life-threatening call, which was a cardiac arrest. And they arrived on the scene and they had no idea what to do. None. So we have an unconscious person lying on the couch that's not breathing and doesn't have a heartbeat. They panicked. And the first thing they did is looked at me and say, "You take over." And from that point on, I had introduced myself as an integral member of the crew, and I subsequently took over the call and assigned different assignments. You start an IV, you get the monitor, I'll intubate the patient, and subsequently we worked as a cohesive unit in an effort to give this patient the very best care that we could give him. That in itself kind of put my name out throughout the entire department as someone that knew exactly what they were doing. And from that point on, I don't believe I was ever actually challenged on any of the calls that I went on.
You know, it's worth just to provide a bit of context here to what you're talking about, John. You know, throughout the 1970s, the city of Pittsburgh put together a pretty fierce resistance to Freedom House, even as it became clear that EMS was not simply a fad, but was here to stay and was an integral part of the emergency medicine chain. They never warmed up to Freedom House. They cut the budget, the operating budget, by 50%, and then continued to reduce it from there. They, as John said before, they put a bunch of bureaucratic hurdles in front of them, and the service really struggled to keep itself going. However, in spite of that, in 1974, summer of 1974, the federal government says, you know, we need to get a handle on this thing. And so what we're going to do, this thing being EMS, they said, what we're going to do is we need one service in the country to field test the nation's very first standardized training program. We need one doctor to devise it, and we need that doctor's group of paramedics to carry it out and show us how this needs to be done. So basically what they said was, we need the poster child. We need somebody to set the standard in American pre-hospital care. And at that time, Miami had a huge program. Jacksonville had a huge program. Seattle, Los Angeles, as I said before, was made famous by a television show that was shot there. New York had the world's first hospital-based ambulance system. So there were a lot of major cities that had a leg up. And yet, through the help of Dr. Nancy Caroline, who literally wrote the book, when I went to EMT school decades later, hers was the book I read. Through Dr. Nancy Caroline and the Freedom House paramedics, they won that contract. And so despite having maybe the smallest operating budget of any EMS company ever, and facing tremendous hurdles, both official and non, they named themselves the standard. And that was the service that the city of Pittsburgh shut down in the fall of 1975. And that was the group of people that they sent to pump gas or frisk prisoners or to silently ride third on emergency calls. And I know that we have some questions. John, if you want to, take a moment to sort of talk about what you feel, the legacy of Freedom House, your personal feelings and legacy, kind of, what's the lasting measure of this service?
Well, the lasting measure to me, basically, and it's getting the foundation out there. It's letting people know where the foundation of EMS as we see it today originated. And the one thing that saddens me to a point is that here in the city, oftentimes I see EMS units all flying up and down the street and lights and sirens going, and they have that state certification seal on the side of the vehicle. And I often wonder, do these individuals really know where the foundation of EMS actually began? Do they really know where the design of that vehicle that they're riding in came from? Do they really have an idea, all of this equipment they had been trained to use, who used it before them? Who set the standards? Who made it possible to let the medical community know that you could use an intubation tube outside of an operating room, or a heart monitor? Or did we really know who first thought about transmitting an EKG from the field to the hospital? So from that standpoint, I often look and think about that every single time I see an MS unit. So as a result of that, I put forth a campaign. It was a self-deriving campaign because it met hurdles. I challenged the city leaders to recognize Freedom House. So I sent a proposal to our city councilmen, to the mayor, and I said, this is the foundation of EMS. There's nowhere in the city that anyone gives any recognition to this organization except the foundation, the equipment, the vehicle design, and everything. I want to see Freedom House receive recognition in the city of Pittsburgh because this is where it all began. So I was able to convince the mayor and the city council people to place a Freedom House emblem on the side of every city of Pittsburgh paramedic units. And they're to be permanently installed there as a tribute to the women and men and people that worked at Freedom House. That's my proudest moments, in addition to the work that's Kevin doing, because he's working along with myself and he's doing the majority of the work, keeping the legacy of Freedom House alive. And that's the one thing that once my career ended, I said, I don't ever want to see that legacy fall by the wayside. So I've kind of committed to making sure that that legacy of Freedom House stays alive, because I know the trials and the tribulations and the hurdles and the barriers that the people that worked there had to overcome to set these standards, to write the book, to open up jobs for every paramedic that's actually working in that career path in this country. And that's the one thing that I think I'll cherish actually for the rest of my life, that we, despite all the different obstacles and barriers and hurdles and transitions that we had to go through, we were still successful at laying the foundation of an EMS system that's now glorified throughout this country. It's glorified, like Kevin was saying, on television. Every time I see 911 Lone Star State, I start yelling at the television. That isn't the way you're supposed to do it. No, you're killing the guy and stuff. So, but I know in my heart that that's where it all began. And so I've taken on another hurdle, which is trying to improve diversity in pre-hospital care. And I started that when I worked for the city of Pittsburgh. I designed the first diversity recruitment program in the city of Pittsburgh. It was a great idea, but I didn't know where we were getting the money from. So the powers that be was convinced that somebody that was yelling and screaming and hollering about diversity had some type of credibility behind them. So they found the money to both hire, train, and pay these students to the program. And it was very, very successful up until I left. So now it's no longer in existence.
Well, I'd just like to real quick close, or at least, and then we'll open to questions. But John is too humble to say it. I have never been accused of humility, so I will say it. He was a badass in his time, and my favorite story of all the things that I have heard from John through all of our many, many hours of talking, when they first got the ability to intubate a patient, which is to slip a breathing tube through someone's trachea and then breathe for them. Nobody had seen that before in Pittsburgh, and they come rolling into the hospital, and this doctor turns around and he sees a patient lying on a stretcher with a breathing tube sticking out of him, and this is not supposed to happen outside the hospital, and the doctor's furious. And he says, "Who the hell did this?" And John in the background says, "I did." And everybody spins around, and here's this guy, this young guy in his, in his 20s, and he's got his little jacket on, and he's got this smirk on his face, and I've seen the pictures, his little glasses and his beard going and his afro, and they're kind of looking at him, and the doctor says, "Well, who are you?" And he says, "My name's John Moon, and I'm from Freedom House." Right. That moment is just, to me, that's it. That's all you need to know about what these guys did and what they brought to the rest of us.
Very much, very much. And I enjoyed that moment, believe it or not. It was a terrifying moment.
You should.
I really enjoyed it. So, but I can talk and talk and talk about Freedom House till tomorrow. And I'm highly motivated by questions. So as Kevin was saying, I'm open to any questions or comments or concerns that anyone may have.
All right, so I have some questions from some of our students, and some of them kind of are the same, so I'm going to kind of consolidate some of them. But I have one from Miss Melanie McCoy. Thank you, Melanie. It says, "What did you tell yourself, or how did you remain calm when your patients were unkind?" And I also have some others that kind of go down that path when patients were like trying to refuse care just based on the color of your skin. How did you kind of convince them this is in your best interest?
Well, that's a very, very good question, primarily because during that time, I understood that if you could get me upset by your actions, whether it be actions or words or whatever, then you controlled my reaction. And during that time, I was determined to not give you the control. So if you got me to react to what you said or how you looked or what you refused to allow me to do, then you had control of me. It's my job to maintain control of that situation, not yours. So I still had to approach that patient with empathy and compassion and concern and care as I normally would anybody else, and not get so caught up into what they didn't want me to do, because they are the ones that made the decision to not allow me to touch them or do a particular procedure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I got a few more. I got Mr. Duckworth wants to know, now in your shoes today, did you ever imagine that EMS could develop as it has from what you started so long ago? And are you happy with the service as it is at present?
Yes, I'm very happy with the service the way it is today. And I'm awfully glad that I was able to be a part of that foundation, number one. Number two is that, yes, I did. I expected this career path to branch out into other different areas, primarily because it was instilled in us during the time that we were at Freedom House, is that you can never do enough for the patient. It was also instilled in us to always look for the things that are not readily apparent. And by doing that, it gave me the idea that Freedom House itself has set the boundaries that had to do nothing but expand throughout this
Right.
country. And that definitely made me very proud. So yes, I
Yeah.
definitely expected it to
Good,
change.
good. So I also have a couple questions about Dr. Caroline and Ms. Hendricks. Thank you, Ms. Hendricks, for asking the question. How was it working under Dr. Caroline? And kind of combined a couple other questions about Dr. Caroline. Kind of tell us your first impression about her, and like, was there a turning point? I mean, I know that she was really relentless, and I'm a little bit like this too with my students. Like, I put the bar up here and I'm like, and so they get a little frustrated with me, but I mean, just tell us about Dr. Caroline.
It may be difficult for you to envision this, but when Nancy Caroline arrived at Freedom House, there was a mood of distrust. Here we have this Caucasian woman coming in and wants to boss everybody around and tell us what to do. And so there was distrust there. We didn't know what to expect. We looked at it as here someone's coming to take over this service. So she had to gain our trust, number one, and we had to gain her trust. She had to gain our respectability and likewise. And she did that in a very authoritarian way. And she was about 5'2", and she never yelled at anyone, but she questioned every single thing we did. And by questioning every single thing we did, she was instilling confidence in us to want to do more. And I can't help but continually thank her for every single thing she did, because it was her. And I'll run through a particular incident. We picked up a patient one day and we took the patient to the emergency room. En route there, we were going over the presentation that we were going to give to the emergency room staff. And she and I were just going back and forth with different ideas on how to approach the emergency room staff and stuff. So I got this dissertation down pat. We took the patient in and I started rattling off. We have a 30-year-old patient that had a syncopal episode while at work, lifting some boxes. Physical exam initially went unremarkable. He had a Brady tachyrhythm on his heart rate. His pressure was fluctuating up and down. Lung sounds were clear. Pulse rate was kind of thready, but he did have a heart murmur early on. Monitors showed normal sinus rhythm, no abnormal rates. For the most part, he was relatively stable. I presented this to the emergency room nurse. She busts out laughing because she was not used to hearing anyone come in and present that type of information that well. So me, for one of the times, as I told you, I allowed her to control the situation. So I left angry, went back to Nancy Caroline and said, look, I don't know why we have to learn all this stuff. Nobody's going to listen to me anyway. She politely looked at me and said, look, if you don't learn to speak the language in the emergency room or throughout pre-hospital care, no one will ever listen to you. She says, go back in there and find a physician and do the same thing, which subsequently I did, and it was received with open arms. So she was able to instill a level of confidence in us that we never knew we had. She taught me how to read EKG strips in 10 seconds. Yeah. And I mean, the whole gambit from PVCs to tachybradycardia to you name it. 10 seconds, she was able to teach me how to do that by questioning us on what the strip looked like. We had to be scrutinized on every report that we wrote. She would grade it was the letter grade in red ink. We would have debriefing sessions where we would have to stand up in front of the rest of the employees and go over your report. Why did you start an IV? Why was this person's pressure low? What did the monitor show? What treatment did you give them and why? If you had a drug overdose, how much Narcan did you give them? Did you start an IV? Was the patient in shock? What was your drip rate? All the different things that they do today, we did back in the early
70s.
Yes. Nobody else was doing it. So she kind of instilled that confidence into me to let me know that no matter what the circumstances was, that I would be able to handle it and handle it correctly.
Yeah. So you're the guy in the back saying, yeah, I put that ET tube in.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? So you got that confidence because she questioned you so much. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you can imagine the confidence that we had because we spent a lot of time in the intensive care unit at the various hospitals. Imagine Nancy Caroline, who was 5'2", walking down the halls of a hospital with 6 blacks with beards and afros walking with her, walking right into ICU and walking right over to a bed to examine the patient, not saying anything to anybody, but just walking.
Is that not how it was normally done then?
No, that's not how it was normally done. Didn't announce our entrance or nothing, just walk right in the door. And that was the type of confidence that she had. And we will forever remember her as the one that basically instilled our confidence and built up that confidence in each and every one of us.
Well, I see that one of the questions in the chat box is very similar to what you said about the reaction of the doctors in the ER. That basically when you started to speak their language, it doesn't matter where you came from or what you look like. They're going to look at you. And,
yeah, you're absolutely correct. And, and it's just that we had to teach the emergency rooms what to expect when an ambulance brought a patient in, because they weren't used to doing that. Oh, it's an ambulance driver here, set him over there, and you make up the stretcher and go out. But we did more than that. With the foundation of pre-hospital care.
Pre-hospital care, yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much. I mean, we are going to continue to share the story. And like you say, it's your mission to make sure that people get to know the story. I feel like it's my mission to educate the young people about this, the foundation of our care. So hopefully all of these young people will take the story and say, hey, man, like, this is where it came from. And I think that there's already been so many students, the reaction to it has just been like unbelievable. Like what Kevin said about, people had a better opportunity surviving a gunshot wound in Vietnam than they did a car accident here in the States. And you've changed that. And because of the hard work and what you and your Freedom House medics, all of you came together and just revolutionized pre-hospital care for us and saved so many lives in the process. I know we had to lose a lot to get there, but it was not in vain. And we are so grateful that you took the time to speak to us. And we're grateful to Kevin for writing about this and telling us about it.
I just want to add, especially for the students, it's a real great honor to have a founder of emergency medical services in the United States actually be able to talk to our students. So thank you so much. Really, and really appreciate Mr. Hazzard for spreading your word, because it really is important. It's, it's an integral part of the medical system that we have today. So thank you for your hard work.
You're welcome. And feel free to reach out to me anytime. This is a dream of mine because Freedom House was near and dear to my heart. And it's my lifelong goal is to make sure that that foundation, that legacy, that all of those people that work there is not forgotten.
Yeah.
And whatever it takes to do that, I'm always on board with it.
Yep. Us too. Us too.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So.
Thank you so much.
Nice to see you again, Kevin.
Every time, John, every time.
How's the weather in my favorite city?
It has been warmer, my friend. I think I need to pack up and go back to California. I don't know what's happening here, but they have ruined this place. It's far too cold.
Are you back in Atlanta now?
I am. I'm back in Atlanta, and
Right.
it's not supposed to. This isn't how people are supposed to live in February. I don't know what this is all about.
We had nice weather down here today, at least.
It's been
Today
pretty
was-
decent compared to the rest of the country, right? Texas is
Yeah,
having,
7 degrees here now.
yeah.
Yeah, 7 degrees.
Are you probably glad you're not working
Yes.
the streets anymore?
Yes, I am. You're absolutely correct.
I don't want to be working that.
Absolutely correct about that. I miss taking care of people. I miss the employees, and I love the departments, both of them. But I'm still enjoying the life of a retired person right now, too. I really appreciate all the help that you're doing, and thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Yeah,
allowing me to be part of
thank
this.
you. I mean,
Thank
for,
you.
for sharing your story with us. I mean, honestly, it's amazing. And I wish that you someday, I want you to come to Charleston and just walk in the room and talk to these kids, and they're just going to be, you'll see their faces and hear the story. It's just,
I'd love to do that.
all right. It's the deal. Once we get back to normal, we'll do that. All right.